All right, so recording in progress. Good evening. This is the June 15, 2022 meeting of the Cohasset Planning Board. Let's start with a roll call of who's here. Clark, starting with you. You're muted, Clark.
Clark Brewer here.
Tom Callahan here.
Amy Glassmeyer here.
Kevin Hine here.
And with us is our planner, Lauren Lind, and our town council, Carolyn Murray, and off in the attendee list is Angela Giso taking our minutes. All right, so the first order of business is we have to open a public hearing for a site plan review, and then that will be immediately subject to a motion to continue it. So Lauren, if you wouldn't mind reading it, the notice.
Certainly, thank you. Notice of public hearing, Cohasset Planning Board. Pursuant to Mass General Law, Chapter 40A and Section 300-5.12 of the Cohasset zoning bylaws, the Planning Board will hold a virtual public hearing on the Zoom platform, webinar ID 862-8518-7562, password 277020 on Wednesday, June 15th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. for a site plan review for property being shown on Cohasset Assessor's Map B331, 175 Lamberts Lane, Cohasset, Massachusetts 02025. The application is for site plan review for a proposed raise and reconstruction of golf club maintenance buildings. The application is submitted by Cohasset Golf Club. A copy of the application plans and accompanying documents are on file in the town clerk's office at Cohasset Town Hall, 41 Highland Avenue, with office hours of Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m., and Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Electronic copies of said application can be obtained by contacting Planning Director Lauren Lind via email at lind@cohassetma.org. Any person interested or wishing to be heard on the application should access the virtual meeting at the time designated. Signed, Amy Glassmeyer, Chair, Planning Board, and moving forward, we'll change that to Tom Callahan, Chair, Planning Board. Thank you.
Just a correction, Tom.
Yeah.
It's not 305.12. We don't have that section. It's 12.6, 300-12.6 for site plan review.
Okay.
I just happen to have my zoning bylaw out.
Don't we all? So I'll entertain that as a motion just to amend the public notice so that it's correct and citing the right section. Somebody second Clark's motion to that.
I'll second.
Thank you. All right, so entertain a motion to continue this. I guess the Lauren, if you want to explain why we're continuing it.
Certainly, yes. So we had a peer review the project in advance of the opening of the public hearing. They issued a peer review letter, and the applicant, in response to that, asked for one more week so that they could respond to the peer review information. So they've asked for a continuation to June 22nd at 6:30 p.m.
Okay, so can I have a motion to continue it to that date and time?
I'll continue it to that date and time.
Okay, give me a second, please.
I'll second.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, roll call vote, Clark. All right, Tom Callahan, aye. Amy,
Amy Glassmeyer, aye.
Kevin,
Kevin Hine, aye.
and Deirdre Hobson has joined us. Deirdre, your vote on motion to continue?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. I'll assume Clark was an aye, but all right, that takes care of that. The other thing I want to get out of the way before we do our other business is minutes. And I understand we have what, 2 sets or 3 sets of minutes.
I know that you have June 1st, and I am not certain. I have not been able to confirm which May date you have. So regrettably, I can only advise you to vote on June 1st if you're so ready.
No, hold on. I think we got May 25th today.
That's correct.
All right, so anybody have any comments on either the June 1 or May 25 minutes?
I will second, I
Well, none being heard, I'll entertain a motion to approve both sets of minutes. Both May 25th and June 1st, 2022.
I'll
So
second.
moved.
All right, Clark moved, Amy second. Roll call vote, Clark,
Clark Brewer, aye.
Tom Callahan, aye. Amy,
Amy Glassmeyer, aye.
Kevin Hine, aye.
Deirdre Hobson, aye.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, and I'm gonna let Lauren give us some brief updates on things that are going on, to do it now while we're a little fresh rather than at the end of the meeting. So Lauren, floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I just wanted to announce, we have our next meeting is actually 1 week from today. It's June 22nd, 2022. We will review, we have a re-advertised special permit for 90 Howard Gleason Road for the land alteration. The reason why we needed to re-advertise that was because we lost a vote in quorum after the election. So we'll be sort of starting that special permit hearing anew. We have the continuation of 46 Border Street, which is the Atlantica site, the site plan review continuation. We have the continuation of the site plan review for the tradesman bays up on Route 3A, 25 and 30 Situate Hill. And then we had been planning to revisit 94 Black Horse Lane. They have a common driveway application that had been continued from April. However, at this point, it's looking like we're actually going to be putting that on our subsequent meeting, which is July 13th, 2022. We have recently received a new application for a preliminary subdivision for the same site at 94 Black Horse Lane. If the planning board members who have been here for a couple of months will realize that we had previously had a 94 Black Horse Lane preliminary subdivision that was denied earlier this year. That was under the previous owner. The property has sold and the new owner is now coming forth with a preliminary subdivision application. The engineer did indicate in their voicemail to me when they reached out about this application that this process is again seeking to begin that zoning freeze process, which for new members, we'll get more into this when the time comes, but there's a process in which you can go through subdivision preliminary followed by a definitive subdivision application in a certain period of time that would potentially enable someone for a zoning freeze for a series of several years. And like I said, more information to come on that. But then the other final update for our July 13th meeting is that we received the pending application that we had been knowing was coming for quite some time. That is the special permit and site plan review application in the Village Business District for 55 South Main Street, which is the gas station located across from French Memories. So we have all that information. All of that information is available on the town website under the active planning board application. So you can, get started not only for next week, but also if you're interested, get a head start for the July 13th meeting material. Two more updates. Just one, I wanted to make you all aware that Elm Street Corridor Working Group will be reconvening next week on Thursday, July 23rd via Zoom at 3:30 p.m. This group is reconvening for the first time since February. It's been a bit of a long process, but we're sort of convening at the final meeting now. They have cost estimations for some alternatives for the Elm Street corridor, and this will be their sort of final take at a recommendation for return to the select board and turn this process over to the Department of Public Works to proceed with the corridor project. And then finally, I just wanted to update you that we had a meeting today with our IT department and our vendor contract who works for our online permitting system. And we have basically a beta test version of a series of our planning board applications. So this has been a long time coming that we've wanted to get all of our permits online so that they're integrated with Permitize, which is the program that we use for our building, Board of Health, trench permits as it is right now. So the system will be fully integrative. By the time we're ready to roll this out, you will be able to look up a site and see all of the active or issued permits, whether it's denied, withdrawn. It's a really, it's exciting. It's a good thing for us. From a staff perspective too, it streamlines and makes a lot of, better efficiencies in our work process. So that's moving along. And today was the first meeting we had in quite some time to see that beta test site. So we'll be working through that and more updates to come, hopefully, later this summer. So that's exciting news. I think that's really all I have for you for now. I'll turn it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And the other thing about our calendar, Wednesday, the 29th, we are tentative, I guess that's a hard date right now, will be the vote of this board and the select board to fill Paul Grady's vacant seat. So that should be short, but please make yourselves available on the 29th as well. And Clark, you may have already seen him trying to get a meeting for the zoning bylaw working group on Wednesday, the 6th of July. Whether we have at least 4 members and we can move forward, I hopefully will have the whole board filled by July 6th. Amy, I did see your hand. I'm not forgetting you. Go ahead.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I'd just like to know if given the lapse in meeting of the Elm Street Corridor Working Group, will there be a summary of where the group stopped or took a pause so that anybody that joins that conversation will be able to follow it, at least in the last 2 months?
Yes, that's the first item on the agenda, actually, is a summary of action to date. And then we will go into what we're here to review since our last meeting, and then summarize next steps before the working group makes a recommendation.
Thank you.
Does anybody else on the board have a general thing to bring up now rather than bring it up at the end of the meeting? Anybody have anything they want to discuss quickly? Hearing none. All right, we'll go into our main business for the evening, which is continuation of the public hearing on an amendment to the common driveway regulations. And for orientation for anybody, I don't know if there's anybody in the public is here, or for our new members, we have a set of regulations called the Common Driveway Minimum Standards. It appears they were last amended in June of 2011. And it governs the length, construction, and the number of houses that can be served by a common driveway. What we have before us tonight is a proposal that came out of the zoning bylaw working group to amend those regulations, amending both the common driveway part of it, and then adding some design and construction standards for private roads that are not common driveways, but also not roads that were approved under the subdivision control law. And much of the language of that section came from a bylaw in Plymouth rather than a regulation, and was thought by the working group to be a good idea to have all aspects of access to a residential property have some design and construction standards, minimum lengths or maximum lengths, and the number of properties that can be served. So that is what's before us. We have had a couple of hearings about it. Town council has made some edits to it back in January, and that's the version I am reading from tonight. And I hope I apologize for the late email. I just had a hell of a day, but just if everybody can have that January town council marked up version, that's the one we'll work from tonight. You can find it on the planning board's page. Yes, Clark.
Is that the bottom one on the
Yeah,
webpage?
I believe it is. It's the one with the January data.
That's correct. I just emailed it all to you. The link, the direct link to the document.
Okay, good, thank you. So, so as a preliminary, I mean, my thought tonight was, as I've tried to do before, is go through this section by section. Some will obviously be more controversial or generate discussion than others. But first, the last time we met on this, an attorney who represented a property owner in town raised the threshold issue of whether we could actually promulgate this regulation in its current form. Now, obviously, we can take the common driveway part and we can regulate that. That's an existing regulation. And his legal premise was, and it's a correct premise, that there needs to be some authority in the underlying law for the authority to promulgate a regulation. So we asked Carolyn to check into that, and Carolyn has circulated an opinion that I hope everyone's had the time to look at. Carolyn, I don't want to, should prep you to put you on the spot, but if you wouldn't mind summarizing your opinion for us, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. The short answer is that the board does have the authority to regulate common driveways that serve 3 or more lots. And you have the authority to regulate certain private ways that were laid out under the subdivision control law. And I put together kind of a lengthy memorandum outlining your source of authority for all of those, because they don't come from just one particular source. But there's generally authority that is found. We'll begin with your own zoning bylaws enacted under Chapter 48 of the Zoning Act. And then specifically Section 300-7-3 of your bylaw that specifically refers to the design and construction of common driveways, as I said, serving access to 3 or more lots. And in particular, calling for the planning board to promulgate regulations thereunder. There's also the subdivision control law that also comes into play here, and this is Chapter 41. Under the subdivision control law, we have a couple of different categories of roads. We're not going to be talking about roads that were approved under the subdivision control law process, because those roads would have been approved by the planning board. So tonight we're focusing on roads that otherwise were created, but they were not laid out and approved by the planning board under the subdivision control law. So one of those types of roads would come into play when the board is acting on what's called an A&R plan, or an approval not required plan. And basically, it is still a form of a subdivision plan, but it doesn't have to go through the formal subdivision process. That's why it's called an approval not required plan. By statute, what the board has to look at with respect to an A&R plan is whether or not the lots shown on the plan have frontage on a way, and whether or not that frontage complies with current zoning requirements. And specifically with the A&R statute, there are specific ways that those lots have to have frontage on. One way is what we call a public way, which would be a way that has actually been laid out and formally accepted by town meeting as a town way. There are ways that may not have been actually accepted by town meeting, but the town clerk certifies that they are in fact ways that are open for use by the public. There are ways that were laid out prior to the adoption of the subdivision control law. And then finally, there would be ways that are laid out under the subdivision control law. Now, with respect to ways that were not laid out under the subdivision control law, I cite to case law in my memorandum to the board. And I know that Mr. Brewer did distribute some cases earlier, maybe it was yesterday. The 2 cases on point are Toothaker versus Bill Ricca and Berg versus Lexington. Those are both cases that involved pre-subdivision control law ways. And the question had come up with respect to whether or not the planning board has any authority over those ways. And the court still concluded that even though they were pre-subdivision control law ways and lots were conveyed out, the planning board could still regulate the construction and standards of those ways. However, the construction and standards of those ways has to give way to any private property rights. So for example, if a way had been laid out in, let's say, 1920, before the subdivision before the subdivision control law took effect in Cohasset, those lots, any lots that were conveyed out, they have the right to use the ways shown in that subdivision for all purposes for which a road is used. But if that pre-subdivision control law way was only laid out with, let's say, a 15-foot travel lane, and if our current standards require a 20-foot wide travel lane, then we may not necessarily be able to impose that 20-foot travel lane requirement on this pre-subdivision control law way without impacting the rights of private property owners who abut that way. So we do have the authority to regulate these ways to make sure that they do provide adequate access. However, we do have to recognize that our requirements do have to yield to private property interests. So unless we're going to start taking certain swaths of land by eminent domain, we'd have to recognize that the roadway width in my 15-foot wide scenario would have to yield to the board's regulations. Another source for the board to regulate common driveways in addition to section 7.3 of the bylaw also comes in other aspects of your bylaw when you're acting as a special permit granting authority. And usually there is some special permit criteria that talks about making sure that there is proper traffic, pedestrian, site circulation, and access. So in those, with respect to those criteria, or when you're acting as a special permit granting authority, you do have authority also to regulate common driveways. The one caveat I would impose here, however, is since your bylaw currently only allows you to regulate common driveways serving 3 or more lots, if we have a common driveway just serving 2 lots, I see no basis for the board's authority with respect to that common driveway unless there is a related special permit that is involved. So that's the thumbnail sketch of my opinion. And I'm happy to answer any questions the board might have.
It does. Does anyone have any questions for Carolyn at this point? No? Okay. Clark, since you did circulate these cases.
Excuse me.
Yes, I
do
didn't.
have a question. Ms. Murray, for the benefit of the public as well as the members of the board, could you provide an empirical example of what you're describing? Because it is abstract in the way in which it's specified in the law. So we have numerous examples of this in town. Or let me just say, I know that we have examples in town. Could you use a case or even create a case so that all of us could understand the significance of what you've just said?
I'm happy to answer that more in the hypothetical, because I don't think that we should be talking about any specific examples that have either come before the board previously or that may be coming before the board or pending with the board. But I think the common driveway should be fairly self-explanatory. If you've got a common driveway serving 3 or more lots, the board has the authority and in fact has already, as Mr. Callahan noted, has already adopted regulations to establish some standards for those common driveways. So setting aside the common driveways, let's take a way that was laid out prior to the adoption of the subdivision control law. So let's take a way that dates back to let's say the 1920s. And, we are certainly familiar with some roads in town that just kind of grew up based on the way cows were brought to pasture and were only made to be wide enough maybe for a cart path and things of that nature. Certainly not a road laid out with 20 feet of roadway pavements and granite curbing and sidewalks and grass strips on either side. If we have one of those pre-subdivision control law ways that comes before us and folks are looking to maybe create some new lots, or there are lots that perhaps also existed under our single lot exemption bylaw, but have never been developed, then as part of the permitting process for that house, the board or multiple houses, the board can look at the adequacy of the way. Does the way provide adequate width and construction and grades? Those are usually the 3 criteria that the subdivision control law allows the board to look at to provide access to the buildable portion of the lot. This is also a concept that sometimes is known as providing, vital access as opposed to illusory access to lots. So in that context, the board could require that the road be brought up to certain current standards as opposed to just a cow path, if that's the width of it. But as I was saying earlier, with respect to the Toothaker and the Berg cases, if there are lots that were conveyed out of that pre-subdivision subdivision that predate the adoption of the subdivision control law in the town. Let's suppose that we have a couple of lots that both front on a way that is only 12 or 15 feet wide. If our current standard is a 20-foot wide traveled way, we cannot impose that 20-foot wide traveled way on top of a 12 or a 15-foot wide existing way without possibly impacting the private property rights of the owners of the lots that abut that way. So if I own the lot that comes right up to the traveled way on this side and someone owns on the opposite side, and that only leaves us 15 feet, that's all the planning board has to work with then in terms of requiring some standards or imposing some standards on that particular way. Because our only other option then is for the planning board through town meeting to look to some eminent domain takings of land on either side of that road in order to make it wider. So that's the exception to just being able to impose your standards. You do have to be cognizant of private property interests and work as reasonably as you can within those confines.
Thank you. I have one other question, which is that, is there any circumstance by which town current regulations about safety and access would come into play in understanding what could be done on a way that was developed at a time or designated at a time with a specification of size which is different than today, and but which poses a safety hazard?
Again, I think if the safety, depending upon what the nature of that safety hazard happens to be, if the safety hazard is that the road has not been properly graded, there are deep ruts in the road, for example, maybe it was never paved, or maybe it was partially paved, but the pavement has worn away. And if that now poses a safety concern, then yes, the board could require that the way or some portion of the way be graded, maybe even paved or gravel put down or some construction standards applied. If the safety issue is something a little different, let's take a site distance issue, for example. Maybe the way has a hill topography that comes up, and maybe it's difficult to be able to see if you're coming out of a driveway. Maybe the way is winding or takes a 90-degree turn somewhere. The board may be limited in what it can do in those circumstances to improve those conditions. Again, just going back to, if you've only got 15 feet of traveled way to work with, you may not be able to address every safety issue that presents itself.
Thank you. One last question, which is that there are multiple entities within the town that has responsibility for the safety and security of citizens. So if it was to be that the fire chief determined that the existing width of a way or its configuration was impassable on the basis of what is necessary to fight or secure public safety, is that a sufficient condition to request a negotiation around what would be an adequate way to ensure that both passage was possible and safety was assured?
Well, the answer is yes, but I want to just be clear about what we're talking about with respect to when you say, entering into a negotiation. The planning board only has jurisdiction over certain projects that come before them. So there may be a private or pre-subdivision control law way that you have in the back of your mind that forms that question. But if there is no particular project that comes forward, there's no avenue for the planning board to impose any of its regulations. But ordinarily, fire emergency vehicle access, yes, that is a public safety concern. So certainly we see that in particular in the ANR context, that if the fire chief were to say to you, I cannot possibly get a fire truck down this long, windy common driveway, private way, whatever it happens to be, to access that house if it's on fire, that is something that the planning board could try to address.
Because
Can I-
that's in the context of a permit, whereas Amy, your abstract question about the fire chief just walks down the street and says this is inadequate. Unless it involves a permit, we're not involved in that. That will be up to the select board to take on, either negotiate with neighbors or do an eminent domain taking to make it wider. That's, again, Carolyn's correct. We just act in the context of permits before us and then apply these standards to those permit applications.
I appreciate that. I think the clarification of what our boundaries are is useful for all of the members of the planning board to understand under which circumstances can seek a remedy for a security or safety issue which belongs in another domain. So thank you.
No, just
All right.
a quick
Yeah,
comment
yeah,
that's
Clark, I
related
was-
to that, just related to that. 25 years ago, Chief Lincoln, who was the fire chief at the time, asked me about a tree that had a branch that was hanging over the road about 11 feet high, and his trucks are 10 feet high. He said, "Can you take the tree down, Clark?" And I said, "Yeah."
Yeah.
So, I mean, the chief has a prerogative to try to make sure that access to all houses in Cohasset is available, safe, and in an emergency, in a rush, that safety vehicles can get to wherever they need to get to.
Yeah, but that's in a, yeah, that's a
different than
different
widening
context.
it
Yeah,
in.
different context than a permit application. And,
Yep.
but
It's
if,
informal.
yeah, but if a resident like that in that situation said, no, I'm not taking the tree down, then, then the town has to make a decision. Is it going to take stronger action to do that, to make the road safe? And that's outside of our purview. So,
But I think it points to, reasonable people doing reasonable things.
correct. All right, so before we go over this, one other thing, Clark, so since you distributed these cases and, I asked you the question today, what for, because I thought they might also apply to something else, but is there anything you want to add about, or a point you want to make about distributing these cases? I understand from your clarification that these are cases that Carolyn cited in her opinion. So I don't know if there's any particular point you were trying to make.
Well, in the last paragraph where she says, she thinks the board has the ability to make access regulations for private ways based
Yep.
on these two cases.
Right.
And, personally, reading case law as a non-attorney layperson, I've got to read the case law 3, 4, 5 times and then sort of catch on to most of it, but maybe not the nuancy stuff.
That's why you're supposed to hire lawyers.
No, well, I'm a member of the planning board, have been for a while now, and this case law was cited. So I think it was my responsibility to read it
Yep.
for for it to have a reasonable discussion. Now, the two cases, Carolyn cites Toothaker versus Billerica, where there's some nuance to this, where a property owner had 1,200 lots in Billerica, had conveyed 600 lots out previously. So from an 1,800 lot subdivision, 600 lots have been conveyed out. And the question was, because the planning board in 1963 said, hey, you've got to upgrade your dirt paths. And the owner didn't want to. So they, so the courts upheld the planning board's rights to require upgrades from dirt paths for a very large tract of land, but also said that the lots that had been conveyed out, as Caroline already pointed out, had certain rights and couldn't be interfered with as a part of creating a real subdivision roadways. So that was interesting. I'm not sure it relates exactly to our condition. There may be other case law that has different ways of relating to our circumstances for access issues. And then the other, Berg versus Lexington, seemed to be more targeted towards the Cohasset example of access regulations. But it was funny. Apparently the planning board said you didn't get written permission from whoever had a fee interest in the way to improve it, so you couldn't improve it. And then the courts said that they did have the right to improve their lots with roadway building. It's a little bit more related, I think, to our generalized access discussion, but I think there may be other case law examples that weigh in on one side or the other of our particular set of circumstances.
Well, yeah, I mean,
But-
again, the underlying premise is that these cases say we can do what we're doing, but what we're going to do
But-
is going to be tied to our particular
But
situation.
yes, Tom, how the case law stuff works is it's similar, close, but there's almost never a case law that's your exact situation. I mean, it happens, right, Carolyn? It happens, but generally speaking, 90% of case laws have some particular nuancy detail that makes what you're looking at in terms of another circumstance that's related, but not 100% there. And I think these cases are fall into that category where we could use these and perhaps other cases to try to come up with an access regulation that makes sense for Cohasset. But I want to just briefly change the subject because I think that we have two buckets to talk about here. One is changes to the common driveway standards, and the other is these access regulations. And I would suggest that the common driveway standard discussion is probably simpler and more straightforward to have and complete than the access regulations for private ways. I think that it's what you've drafted compared to what exists is about a 2% complexity compared to creating new access regulations for private ways that predate zoning.
Well, let's go through this in the way it's been drafted, because we've gone back and forth on that particular point a number of times, and we drafted the regulations separately and then thought it was best to combine them. So let's deal with it and see how we get through it, Clark. So because not everybody shares this view, but I'm on the mindset that none of this is rocket science to deal with. But all right, so in looking at the draft from January that's in front of you, you'll see comments in the, sometimes I noticed when it printed out, there's at least one page where the comments got all convoluted over the text. So I don't think it's super critical, but we'll deal with that. But in the comments, you'll see TC and a number. Those are my comments that were written originally as explanation. The CMM comments are Carolyn's, where actual suggested changes in the original text are made. And we will be dealing more with those. Mine aren't suggestions, they're just explanations for what these different sections are. So section 1, background and purpose, we sort of have that in our common driveway regulations. This was text taken largely from Hingham's bylaw or regulations, and it was just thought by the person who put it together that it was just a clean explanation of what it is we're trying to do with these regulations. The main understanding being that the job of the planning board and the zoning bylaw is to promote public safety in large part and for adequate access and durability of roadways. So again, I don't know that this generates a lot of discussion. Carolyn has a comment on some language change that makes sense, and I would agree with and would incorporate into this. Does anybody have any particular questions, comments on section 1?
So just so I understand, this draft regulation combines common driveways with the private way access regulation. So it would be a wholesale replacement of
It would be a
the common
replacement.
driveway
It would be a
standard.
replace, yes, it was, so again, we have a common driveway regulation. We found in the Plymouth bylaw a regulation for the non-subdivision private roads that we've been discussing. In the discussions within the working group, there was first drafting them separately, but then it thought it just makes sense to combine the two and to have all issues related to access dealt with in one place. And it'll be, the next section 2 kind of explains the division between the different types of access, and maybe, but that'll make that more clear what we're actually doing here. So anybody else have any thoughts, comments on section 1? Okay, so I would, you know, we'll vote on this all in the end, but I would at this point go forward with section 1 as amended by Carolyn and her comments CMM1. The next section, number 2, explains what exactly these regulations apply to, and the bullet points are they're set out so it's clear, the public understands these are the ways one accesses a residential lot, either by a road that's approved under the subdivision control law, by a common driveway, or by a way in existence before the subdivision control law took effect, which is all of those other private ways in towns that are certainly larger than a common driveway, but were created before the subdivision control law was adopted. And that was adopted in Cohasset, by the way, in February of 54, I believe, February 25, 54. So the other important thing about section 2 in discussing the applicability of these regulations, that it applies to an application to add a new dwelling. So with respect to existing roads, common driveways in town, they would be grandfathered unless they are adding a dwelling to them, which increases the usage and the intensity of use of the road, and then may trigger a requirement for an upgrade. So
Where's that on the, in this section 2?
say what are you asking specifically?
Where's the one house trigger in section 2?
it says in the first sentence, these residential property access roads.
Had to
apply
add.
to
Add a new, okay, thank you.
All right. We'll move on and we'll get to the meat of this thing, which is the next section. So our common driveway regulations right now do set out dimensional and construction requirements for a common driveway. We have on our chart for access for the dimensions right now, a chart that depends on how many houses are being served by the proposed driveway. 3 to 5 houses, 6 to 8 houses, and then it clearly states in our current chart that 9 or more houses have to go to the subdivision control law. So in section 3 here, the chart, let's deal with the common driveway first. Rather than have 2 levels of dimensions, this would now have just 1. And the significant changes are off to the right, but in the left, the layout and the pavement width and the shoulder width come from our existing regulation for the regulation that applies to 6 to 8 houses. Okay, so again, we have 2 grades of regulation, one for 3 to 5 houses being served, one for 6 to 8 houses being served. So those dimensions of 18 feet and 3 feet and 24-foot layout are all taken from that. The smaller limit, just so you know, was 20-foot layout, 15 feet of pavement and 2.5 feet of shoulder. I will tell you, I would entertain going to that if that helps. But let me focus now just on the right side of the chart. The maximum length of a common driveway under these regulations, and this would be a change, would be 350 feet. Today it is 750 feet. And the maximum number of lots that's served would be 3 instead of today's 8. And in the working group, you know, we've done a lot of research and benchmarking of our bylaws and regulations against those of other communities. And I can tell you that the allowed length and the allowed number of houses to be served by common driveways in Cohasset is truly an outlier for suburban towns in this area. The average of number of lots is down to 3, and the length is certainly less, and 350 feet is where we saw the norm to be. So that's the significant change to the common driveway is versus our current regulations. It's the maximum length and the number of lots that can be served. The thinking being that if you're getting up to 8 lots, 8 houses, you know, that should be subdivision control as well, not just the threshold at 9. The threshold should be lower, and that's where it is in most suburban communities. So this is one of the attempts that the working group is looking at to get rid of, you know, our outlier status on so many things. But then the row above it, now we're bringing in regulation of these private ways that are larger than a subdivision. There we will adopt the 750 feet. The maximum number of lots is left open. And the pavement width, you know, the pavement width and the layout are a step up from a common driveway. And the subdivision regulations for Cohasset are in another section of our town bylaws. And I believe the maximum limit on a subdivision road is 1,500 square feet. So this creates a graduated scale of length, common driveway here, non-subdivision road there, and then the subdivision length of road is there. So that's the change in those charts. So who?
Kevin had raised his hand.
Hold on. I was reading, so I didn't see which one of you put your hand up first.
Kevin
but
put his hand up first.
all right, thank you. Kevin, please.
Just a simple point of clarification for my purposes, is layout, is that term defined? I see it in the dimensional criteria. Is that a common construction term, or what does layout mean?
I'll take a shot. The layout is the actual boundaries of the way that could in theory be paved to that point, but usually are not. And any road in this town in front of your house, the pavement may be, let's say, I'm looking at mine right here, let's say it's 16, 18 feet wide, but the layout of this road may be 24 feet wide, which means that on either side, 3 feet of our grass, of what we think is our lawn, is actually part of the road layout, and it could theoretically be widened to that point in the future. It's quite common. It's an understood engineering term in road design that you will have a layout and then you will have pavement, which is something less than that layout. So it's not a term that needs definition in the professional community.
But yeah, just to add to what Tom said, the layout would be whatever the engineers are showing in terms of where the property line is and where the pavement is in relation to the property line, easements and things like that, stuff that you see and stuff that's invisible.
So it's the
Basically
improved
engineering.
area of the road, whether there's pavement there or not, within a defined easement. So if there's a 40-foot easement using that common driveway definition,
Right.
24 feet of it has a layout, which is an area of improved surface, paved, unpaved, whatever it is, as designed and
Yeah.
constructed.
Right.
Okay.
And
Thank
as
you.
we do, as we do, on various occasions in town, when we deal with layouts, it might come up if we're doing scenic road permit, which we haven't done many yet. The pavement is not necessarily straight down the middle of the layout where, there's even pieces of unpaved on either side sometimes, and a lot of times in this town. And I think we saw that with Lambert's Lane a couple of weeks ago, that the actual pavement can be all over the boundaries of the layout. So, anyway, Clark, Kevin, anything else? Kevin?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, all right, Clark?
Yeah, so I had a question about the maximum length. What you're proposing for the common driveway is half or less than half of what we currently have.
Right.
And then you're also proposing a limit to the private ways. I live on a private way that's at least 1,500 feet long. I wonder have you done any inventories of the private ways that would be triggered by this bylaw to have a sense for what the average, what the minimum and what the maximum might be, and the mean, since the 750 feet might mean that 90% this would not apply for. And to the same extent, I don't think that the planning boards, I've recommended that we take a field trip and look at common driveways that have been approved over the last 40 years. And I think we upgraded it from 500 to 750 about 10 years ago. I would like this, I think it would be useful to make a good decision about what that number is, to take an inventory or take a field trip and take a look at, as a board, take a look at some of the common driveways that have been created and have been successful to avoid wetlands, to limit development and provide access to lots. So my question was, is there an inventory? Would it be a good idea to take a look at a half a dozen or a dozen examples?
Let me answer that one way, is that with respect to a road
Well, we
like
can
yours.
discuss it. You don't have to just.
No,
answer
I
it. We can
understand.
discuss
No,
it.
look, I was part of the committee that put this together, so I feel like I'm like the advocate / explainer of this. The answer is, did the working group take an inventory of all the roads and common driveways in town? The answer is no. Existing roads like yours that are over or under these limits, they're grandfathered as long as there's no house being added, and there has to be a finding of inadequacy, which we'll get to further down in these regulations. But On the common driveway, as I said before, the goal was to stop having Cohasset be an outlier. And, you know, the idea of studying this is like that we'll come up again with some Cohasset specific, Cohasset unique regulation. Well, it's our outlier regulations, like single lot exemption, like our frontage, that gets us into quagmires on many occasions. And the 3-lot limit and the 350-foot length was the norm found in other suburban communities nearby. We did do benchmarking on that, and we simply picked the number to bring us in line with a typical nearby suburban community, rather than continuing to be an outlier with these rules that say we're unique and we're exceptional. You know, it's
Just one point.
to get away from that idea.
Just one point, Tom, and I completely understand where you're coming from about the outlier status, but I think that the private way phenomenon in Cohasset, where we have so many, both the unapproved subdivision roadways and the roads that predate zoning. As far as I can see, and for a lot of people, it's a part of the unique part of the landscape of Cohasset. And I'm less convinced by the outlier, you're not the norm in the Eastern Massachusetts argument. That I think that if we do have these regulations, that I think that a certain amount of targeting for our environment, our specific, whatever the pros and cons are of how we've gotten to where we are, should be taken into account into the regulations, as opposed to making it Eastern Mass norm. I mean,
No,
we can talk about it. We can discuss it. What the
No,
pros
I
and
know.
cons of even the concept.
And you know, again, the non-subdivision road thing we borrowed from Plymouth because they have a ton of them. They probably have a very high percentage of non-public roads in Plymouth. And yet they felt at some point, you know, to put some standards on what's going on in Plymouth, to put some regulations in place, or in their case, a bylaw in place to regulate it. I don't think this is the wrong approach, but you know, you'll see this when the working group comes up with, you know, other ideas that have been bandied about, is to get Cohasset away from this, some really crazy and unique bylaws that are unique to ourselves, and it, you know, at various times can get us into trouble. And the current common driveway length and house lot limits to the working group as a whole just seemed as an end around against the subdivision control law. Now, I'll bring this up because I've thought about this myself, is that, you know, we also have, with respect to subdivisions, we have 50-foot frontage. We're the only suburban town around here that has that, or possibly in all of Massachusetts. And we have it uniformly and outside of downtown village areas, which is the only place you'd find it. And, you know, we have to think overall how we are going, you know, at some point, Cohasset did have typical suburban frontage of over 100 feet. In the late 60s, they changed that. Now, that was after my cul-de-sac was permitted, some other cul-de-sacs around here were permitted, and nobody's around to tell us what happened, but the traditional suburban cul-de-sac that the subdivision control law generates, somebody didn't like it and we switched to what we have today. So
Tom,
we do
Tom,
have to
interrupt.
No, let me just make the point.
Excuse me,
about this
let me-
before.
Amy, let me finish. We
I was
do
actually
have to consider in these regulations, as well as things we are going to talk about with the bylaws table of area regulations, of how we want development to take place in this town. Traditional suburban ways or unique Cohasset ways. So I understand your point, and the point is actually well taken, Clark. And it's part of a larger discussion too, that ties into frontage and lot width. Because obviously, if we're lowering the number of the requirements of a common driveway, we are going to encourage subdivisions. 50 years ago, we made a decision to go away from that to this. we're suggesting we start taking a step back towards suburban zoning. That's what this is going on. Amy?
Thank you, Tom. That was the point I wish to make, which is that looking backwards, we could try to find all the people that were involved in making the decisions that took place in the 1960s, and we could inquire as to why they were doing that. But that is an insufficient basis alone to decide what Cohasset should have going forward. We know that we have circumstances which are very difficult to manage from a public safety and a public service perspective. We also know that we have circumstances in the history in the last 20 years where the ways in which regulations were applied were uneven. And we know that by examples such as Ocean Ledge and other cases where passed regulations and they were not carried out to the requirement of the planning board itself. So it doesn't seem to me to be very valuable to argue about what it was. It is really about what we want in the future. And I would say that from the standpoint of the increasing densification of Cohasset and the increasing variation in land uses in Cohasset, that we have to be looking forward and looking around ourselves to see how our neighbor communities have managed growth that they weren't anticipating. We would not be in this discussion had we not had a discovery that we had access to greater sewage capacity. So we're creating an argument about what past was, and we're not really dealing with what is, and we're definitely not dealing about what we could do in the future and on the basis of the community that we think we live in and the community we want to live in. So my feeling is going around and around and around, we are going to find ourselves without any answer to some of the big questions town faces.
I think that's an excellent point, Amy. Thank you for making it.
It is, and again, the working group is working on, is considering these issues, but you know, I'm not saying we return exactly to the past, but we made a fundamental change in zoning that other suburban communities have not taken. We made a significant change in 1969 for some reason. And rather than, not that we haven't had subdivisions, Heritage Way is a very modern example of a subdivision that we've had, but you know, we have a pattern of development of pork chop and rat tail lots going lengths, significant lengths to get to a public way with common driveways. And the question is, do we do that, or do we go back to something more suburban-like, which is larger frontages and creation of more of bigger and adequate roads? And so this whole thing is driven by the safety issue of the adequacy of roads, the adequacy of access for emergency vehicles and the people who live on them. Again, that's the policy issue that's behind all of this, and we can debate that. All right, so did anybody else have any other comment on this particular section? I'd like to try to get through all of it. I'm not suggesting we're going to be voting on this tonight, but I'd like to get through all of it as much as we can here. So does anybody else have any thoughts on the chart?
Is there anything in the mashed up section that's particularly relevant, or?
No, the next section 4 is the design and construction requirements, basically how you build it with the pavement and the underlayment and everything. That comes from our existing regulation, by the way.
But there's some overlapping type on the.
Yeah, I think.
Is there
those-
something that's relevant there? Do you have? the
No,
original?
I think those are both TC comments that just explain what
Would
I
it be
just said.
possible to upload a slightly more cleaned up version?
I will have to see if I have one on my computer, because this is the one I printed off the town website. So
Right, me
But
too.
I'll just say section 4, the design and the drainage things, the design construction requirements, you know, grades, crowns, underlayment, blah, 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 the type of concrete you use. Those are in our existing regulations. The drainage part of it, the next part of it, I believe there was language in the Plymouth bylaw about drainage, but if you see my comment TC4, Brian Joyce, early on in the drafting process, wanted some specific drainage standards that do not exist in the common driveway regs we have today. All we have on drainage, from what I can tell from the existing reg, is the method of drainage for a common driveway shall be approved by the planning board and the highway supplier after notice, with an opportunity to review granted to the Conservation Commission and the Drainage Committee, which we don't have anymore. So Brian Joyce of DPW gave us those drainage standards. And as I understand them, that's standard operating procedure for building any kind of roadway in the Commonwealth today. Carolyn made a comment to that drainage standard about the issue of documentation and inspection. Her comment CMM2. And Carolyn, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that or expand on that. I understand the point of clarifying who's doing these inspections, but
Are folks able to read my comment in the version that they're seeing?
yeah, the CMM2 version comment is clearly out there. So.
It's on
Can
page 5.
can I ask a question of information, which is, we don't need to see each other. Is it possible for us to be looking at the document that we're discussing?
Well, I pulled mine up on the screen from the website.
I
And I have a paper copy in front of me.
would suggest, yeah, I
I
would
have a
suggest,
dialogue.
yeah, I would,
But,
as chair of this, I got to see everybody, and I have a paper copy. I do find that if you pull it up from the planning board webpage on your own, you can zoom it. If I just share a screen with it, or Lauren shares a screen,
Still
with
can't
it,
see.
you can't zoom it, you can't see it. So, if you don't want to be visible and so you can look at this big screen of it, be my guest. But and I apologize, I should have alerted everybody to that earlier.
Yeah, I have mine at like 200%,
Yeah,
250%.
no, but I'm reading off a paper copy that I can still read. So anyway, so Carolyn, going back to that comment CMM2. So this is regarding a provision that says that there needs to be some ensure based on historical documentation inspection that the common driveway, I'm sure it's covering up the private way or common driveway, is not subject to periodic flooding. I mean, my thought is you leave that to the experts. That would be probably the head of DPW. You suggested maybe the Concom agent too. Yeah, I mean, I think the DPW head would be in the best position to determine historical flooding of any kind of roadway in town. But so we can clean that part up, I think, and make that clearer. Kevin, yes.
I just want to circle back just to that last bullet on the one on the construction
Yep.
portion just above us. It talks about an item to be approved by the planning board. And when I read that bullet, I'm not clear what the planning board is being tasked with approving there.
Hold on, where are you?
The bullet, the last bullet for the construction section, right above the where
Oh,
the drainage section
right
starts.
above the drainage. So any new common driveway. Actually, that reminds me where it just says common driveway, since it was borrowed from the common driveway, would have to add reference to the other things we're regulating here too. Any of the restricted date shall be included maintenance and snow removal plan that combines with time snow. Oh, all right. So in many permits, there can come an occasion where there'll be some covenants between the board and an applicant or property owner. And they could be about, they're often typically about drainage and maintenance of sidewalks, curbs, It usually occurs in a subdivision. And these covenants, in order to remain binding on future property owners and that they are aware of them, will get recorded at the register. They'll get approved by the planning board as part of the permitting process. And then they'll get recorded at the registry of deeds so that anyone doing a title search in the future will see that this particular subdivision is subject to these covenants, meaning the owners in that subdivision are going to have to maintain the lighting or the curbing or the sidewalks or the drainage. So this is anticipating, and I'm just see if it's in our existing. Yeah, our existing common driveway regulations, paragraph 10 and paragraph 11, address the issue of covenants as well. So if this particular bullet is we're dealing with a new permit application for a new common driveway, in the same way as we can add covenants to a subdivision, we can add covenants here. Since it's going to be privately owned, not town maintained, you want to make sure that there's some binding requirement on the owners to maintain it to a certain safe standard. So that's what that's designed to do. So
Okay, so just,
so the approval of these covenants, which are basically long-range promises to do something, to maintain something, are common in some planning board permits and would be applied here in a construction of a new common driveway or a new private way. And our existing common driveway regulation says it, but says it somewhat differently, but it doesn't anticipate that there would be covenants. So even today, we get a new common driveway application, we can apply some covenants for the owner and current and future owners to maintain that common driveway to certain construction standards.
sure. And so the reason for I bring this up is because there's specific reference in that bullet to maintenance and snow removal plan.
Mhm.
And plans can evolve. Plans could be inadequate. Plans could not be implemented. There could be a plan and implement, but never implemented, or plans could be implemented and not adequate. So would all those issues fall under the purview of the planning board, or who would be enforcing these? I guess I'm just trying to get some clarification on what's packaged in that bullet and how it would be implemented beyond the covenants. Covenants, I think, are pretty straightforward and
Right.
as they're written. Plans are evolving and live documents that periodically get updated and revised or replaced.
Right. And again, Brian's not listening to us, I believe. I know Brian in our early discussions had mentioned snow removal. And it does reflect that you comply with the town snow plowing policy, which of course is something policy will change from time to as affected and amended from time to time. So I think that the first line of regulation or enforcement is going to fall on the Department of Public Works and as with any other permit that the planning board grants, the building inspector. The planning board has the jurisdiction over common driveway applications. So ultimately it will be the planning board, but like any other permit, its first line is going to be our staff in town. Again, if there's clarification to any of this, please suggest it. None of this is cast in stone. Some of it is, as I say, language from our existing regulation that might not have been clear and hasn't been clear for the last 25 years. So let's take the opportunity to make things clearer where we can. Anybody else? Just move on to which I know is going to be the issues. Section 5. Section 5 is dealing with how these new roads would be permitted. I noticed Carolyn has a comment that grandfathering is not a term in the courts anymore.
Favorite term
right,
these
that's
days,
right.
yes.
We're serious about that.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that. But,
Yeah.
so
It's called existing non-conforming or make something up. as long as
Right,
it's not
so
grandfathering.
there's a number of places where Carolyn's comments going forward mention that with the use of the word grandfathering, so we would just adopt those changes into this, but anyway, so the first step in this process is a determination of whether a roadway is adequate. And again, we don't want to pick on specific examples, but if we have a non-subdivision road in the community, it's currently serving, let's say, 6 houses. It has X feet wide of pavement, and somebody wants to add house 7, perhaps house 8. They have to come for the permit, and the issue is the roadway adequate? Or, as will be coming further down this regulation, will an upgrade of the road to make it adequate because of the added use be required? So again, this will only be triggered for proposed or pre-existing. Let me just say this, if it's proposed, we have design and construction standards, and nobody should be building a new common driveway or a new private way in this town without following this regulation. But for the pre-existing road, which most people will be concerned about, if there is an added use of a dwelling, will that road still be adequate to handle that extra use? So going through, there's the presumptions of, in subparagraph B, the presumptions are that if you build something according to the design standards in these regulations, it would be adequate. And that should be the case for all new construction. If you have a pre-existing road that matches these design criteria, it should be presumed adequate. If your private road is, let's say, 8 feet wide, when we require something closer to 18 feet of pavement, and fire trucks and delivery trucks need that, that's going to raise the question of whether the road will remain adequate with more usage on it. And so C, subsection C, will go into the process of how that is determined. Who's chit-chatting? I'm sorry. All right, and the gist of it, and again, I want you to look at it, look at it and point out anything specific, but the gist of it is that, again, our professional, the building inspector, would make the first level determination. That happens in many other places, in the bylaw in general, there's a place where you can ask for action or enforcement by the building inspector. He makes the first call. There's an appeal process to the zoning board, an appeal process to court after that. Likewise, in this process, building inspector would be the first level of determination of adequacy of a way that is proposed to have an added use to it. There would be notice to the public safety and public works departments so that they too could weigh in on it. And ultimately, if the building inspector's determination of adequacy is challenged, it would come to us in the planning board. Again, mirroring the process that exists in the bylaw generally. So that's
Is there a criteria based on the number of houses? Because there's a point where a two-way lane gets overburdened, right? It's whether it has 3 houses or 7 houses or 20 houses makes a big difference if it's the same width and construction type.
All right, so let me just make one other comment before I get to that. My comment TC9 off to the bottom right there, just so you know, this wasn't all pulled out of thin air. Like in many other new bylaw changes in recent years, I borrowed from Wellesley for this one. So this process was laid out in another community. To answer your question, back in section 3 and 4, no, section 4, so 3 and 4, we have created this design criteria that a common driveway should be X, a private way should be Y. It should be built in a certain way. That is the presumption of adequacy. And then when you have a pre-existing road that does not meet that, the building inspector, and likely in conjunction with public works and public safety directors, are going to make a determination if the roadway that exists today, and let's throw out that it's 12 feet wide. Yes, it doesn't meet our standards, so it doesn't get the presumption of adequacy, but is it still adequate if you add this extra house? Is it adequate if 3 houses are being added? So that's the determination that's going to be made. And then what follows from this is that if you, because of the added use of additional houses, the powers that be, who are the experts in this area, say that this road's going to be inadequate, I can't get a fire truck here, blah, 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 then the upgrade provisions will kick in and an upgrade will have to be made.
Okay, so if it's a 25% increase or a 50% or 100% or 200% that's proposed, that may be the trigger for public safety and the building inspector.
Yeah, it's well,
That's a
I would
judgment.
I would say if for, again, new construction, this shouldn't be an issue because they're going to build to the design criteria. But in an existing road, what I envision happening here is that anything that's less than our design criteria, that's the threshold, is going to trigger the building inspector to have to make a determination of adequacy with input from DPW and public safety. And if she determines that even with this house, the pre-existing condition is still safe and adequate, unless somebody challenges that determination and brings it to us planning board, that's what will go forward.
Sure.
The house will get built with the road existing as it does today, the road or common driveway. If there is a challenge to a building inspector's determination, then it's on us, planning board, to determine if it's going to be adequate. And I think that it's always going to come down to a very case by case, street by street.
Because some roads
we have this.
are a throughway and some are dead ends.
Correct.
And some have half a dozen houses, some have 20 in terms of the private way. So the point of overburdening, reaching an understanding of what the point of overburdening of the current design would be the thing for the building inspector to.
It's going to be, and
it could
ultimately be the planning board's determination, just like so many permits are ultimately our determination, and none of us might be experts in the field, but we are going to rely on peer review. We're going to rely on our fire chief and our police chief, and we're going to rely on our DPW head to all give us their expert opinion of whether a road works or not, and will continue to work if you add a house or two. It's going to be very case by case, and it's hard to say. And a dead end, for example, you mentioned a dead end. There could be dead ends without turnarounds on them. And that today we require turnarounds. The regs as they exist today require turnarounds, and the fire department wants them. So it's going to be, we'll see, but we're going to, I try to, looking at the Wellesley system, is try to put in a process that relies primarily on the experts rather than 5 members of the planning board.
Okay, but should we have criteria spelled out, like for one way, for the percentage increase, for the absolute number?
Well, again, the minimum design and construction criteria are in the previous 2 sections. So that's the threshold we're starting from, is saying this is what we deem to be an adequate way. So you're asking if we're in a situation with an existing road that is less than our design criteria, Do
Well,
we
use
have some
how
of-
as an
do-
example.
do- I
Everyone
know
can
what
relate
you're
to
saying
that.
is there's some of the triggering
It's
measure.
like 16 feet wide and there's like 20 houses on it. And I think that if it was made one way, for example, then there'd be no overburdening in adding one more house. But Black Rock is also a similar example where it's two-way and it's like 15 feet of asphalt and it is overburdened.
Yeah, and Black Rock could be an example if there were houses being added to it that, under this mechanism, there could easily be a finding that Black Rock Road is inadequate to take on any more houses. And so then what happens? So then what happens is a trigger for upgrades that may or may not be able to actually happen because you are dealing with private property rights all along.
Right,
But-
that's like the case law of Berg versus Lexington. It,
Yeah.
it is an issue of getting permission from private property owners to improve their land.
Correct,
The complexity.
correct. And the end result could be that perhaps a new house can't be built on a road because it's so woefully inadequate, that it's just not safe to add anything more to an already unsafe situation. But what I understand what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, okay, so we have this perfect world design criteria and all the new ones will be built to that. Should we have some criteria that triggers, should there be some presumption of inadequacy or adequacy for the existing roads based on, length, traffic pattern, number of houses already served, et cetera, et cetera? If I just gut reaction, like that doesn't necessarily bother me to doing that because we make things more objective. It's easy for us and the building inspector to say yes and no. If we leave it completely subjective case by case in all situations, then, then we get into splitting properly so let me say this. If you have some thoughts on that subject of where you would draw lines, why don't you suggest them or anybody
Well,
else?
I've kind of kicked that around during this meeting, but I will say that the criteria should probably identify what would be considered overburdening of an existing private way. And I will give you an example of my the private way that I'm on. By the way, do you know everybody on this board lives on a private way? Tom's happens to be one of the
Mine gets serviced by the town.
approved but unadopted subdivision.
Yes, my road gets serviced by the town.
Serviced in terms of snow removal?
Snow removal and the last time it was repaved.
Right. Yeah, well, the town has there in its bylaws, as well as in the Mass General laws, there are provisions for snow removal and for repairs of for municipal repairs of private ways. But I wanted to get back to the point. I think there's a overburdening. Like, for example, there's 3 houses on Dolan Lane, 3 existing dwelling units. One has been added recently. That's under construction.
Right.
So that's from 3 to 4. That's a 33% increase. Is it going to be an overburdening? I can't really say as a user. Personally, I don't have any conflicts with vehicles. Maybe once a month where I have to pull over and let somebody pass. But this is the kind of thing where when a private way becomes overburdened and needs an upgrade in order to function reasonably,
All right.
then maybe we could kick that around a little bit.
All right, yeah, so this operates from the presumption, since it started at the beginning to say it applies to the addition of new dwellings, is that it starts from the presumption that any new dwelling generating whatever number of cars and traffic trips per day, that is the first presumption that creates an additional burden to the road. And what I'm hearing you suggesting, are there other criteria we should consider, like the width of the pavement relative to the number of houses that are on it, whether it's a dead end or a through street? And I hear that, but we're starting from the presumption that an added house and an added use is the threshold that triggers a question of adequacy. So-
One more point related to this is the National Traffic Engineers Standards for peak hours of adding one residence is 1 trip per peak hour per house, 1 peak hour trip. That's what they use for roadway design.
Yeah, well, I
And
think,
using their standards might make sense for what we're discussing right now.
yeah, Lauren, I'll have to, if we haven't put Lauren to sleep yet,
Maybe
we'll have.
not we, you, Tom, it's you.
No, I
You're
know,
here to sleep. Not we.
we'll have to talk about whether we need some kind of expert analysis into this and how we would procure that. So I'll follow up on Lauren with that. Kevin, you have appeared from the darkness and have your hand up. Amy, did you have your hand up first?
Amy may have.
Amy,
No,
go
Kevin, Kevin did. I'm waiting.
All right, go ahead.
So, Tom, what I'm hearing is in addition of even one house to an already existing private way could prompt a review as to the adequacy of that private way
Correct.
in some
Correct.
form
So
or another by,
we're talking a pre-existing way right now, to common driveway.
let's say that pre-existing way, that private road is already woefully inadequate, even without the addition of a new home on it or new homes on it.
Yeah, well, that's what Clark and I were just going back and forth about that. And Black Rock Lane, for example, might be an example of that.
I mean, there's ways in this town and some of them are private and we could probably stand at them and find that they flood and they don't properly drain a sufficient amount during the storm events that we regularly get now. And they are inadequate for vehicles to go through without risk of stalling, perhaps inadequate for proper ingress or egress by way of emergency vehicles because they're flooding. I'm just wondering if that's all a part of this so that if that's factored into how these are, what we have in front of us here. And I'm just providing that as an example because we know we're getting these storm events now that are flooding our ways, and we could be downtown, we could be in other parts of our town because they were inadequately designed or because the way they were designed hasn't been maintained and the drainage features that were designed and used for them are not functioning anymore.
Right, and.
What, can I just make a comment on that?
Yeah,
You know, what's really fascinating about Cohasset is that the private subdivision roadways haven't been accepted, that been made public in decades. And it basically has been policy since the 60s.
Yeah.
If Howe Road had been accepted as a public way, then the town would have responsibility for correcting things like drainage problems and getting it on the repaving program. I don't understand why Tad Lane got made a public way and then access out to Jerusalem Road never happened. But we have there's a systemic problem in Cohasset where
yeah, and
the
that's a
town
separate issue.
tries to solve problems on private ways, but doesn't really have an obligation to.
Right, and that's a larger policy question that's been bandied about for as long as I've lived here, and you know, that's the select board's purview of whether should we expand the number of public roads in the town and have the town take over?
Well, I think
Personally, yes, we should.
provide
but it's also
leadership
gonna
on
be-
this.
Sorry, say that again, Clark?
I think the planning board could provide leadership to the Board of Selectmen on this and put a half a dozen roads on the public way recommendation list.
Right.
You know, especially with large amount of houses, like over 20 or something like that.
And then if
Fair Oaks and some of these
Right.
others.
and
And
then
ones
if
that
new
have been
development,
created recently, those could go on a short list of adoption.
sure. And then if there is upgrade that is needed because of new development on that road, it would fall to the town and not to individual property owners. And that's not a bad thing, but I don't have any problem with our board, advocating for such a policy with the town, but I know what the town is going to, the select board and the town manager will come back and say, do you know how much that's going to cost, So,
Yeah, it is
that's going to be
expensive.
the pushback. We've gotten
But-
into this.
It is. We've talked about it off and on and nobody wants to do it because it costs something.
Right.
But I will say, new subdivision roadways that have been created, like, for example, Heritage Lane and the Cook Estate and
Right.
Kuna Messett, the engineering's all in place and
Right,
and
yeah, there's
putting
no
that
reason.
to a road to adopt is not hard.
And there's no reason those newer ones shouldn't be, but, all right, but that's a kind of separate point.
It is separate from what our discussion tonight.
But what this regulation would do as a burden, and to Kevin's point, and we were saying about a particular road, it might be that somebody can't build new and add to a road because it's so woefully inadequate, it can't take any more. And then you're affecting private property rights, and the town has to think about, does it go in that direction, or does it bite the bullet and make more public roads and take on the collective responsibility for these things? But we won't solve that one tonight. But Amy, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. In light of the fact that the conversation is predominantly between 2 and sometimes 3 of the planning board members, I would like to make a recommendation that rather than working out the fine details that we're working on right now, that we ask that 2 of the planning board members, combined with the head of the Department of Public Works, and if it so seems sensible, a manager of the fiscal side of town, to come up with a statement that is comprehensive in revising what it is that we're aiming to do. Because what we're doing here in the public setting is we're dealing with individual words, individual definitions, individual time, space, circumstances. And I don't think we can arrive at an efficient outcome, which makes it possible for our staff to be able to codify what it is we're saying. So I would recommend that rather than us working this out in detail as we are doing it now, is that we create a subcommittee that is within the bounds of public access to knowledge, and try and formulate something which we can bring back to us as a board for decisions, not language verifications or differentiations.
I think that's a good point. But I just wanted to make, Tom's gotten through 6 out of 16 pages. And I think he's just trying to present the status of what was written and worked on back in January. So 5 months ago. And obviously for the whole year previous, that's been worked on off and on. But I think he's just we're just trying to get through one pass. And then you make a good suggestion. I think that
Yeah,
that would be reasonable.
So Lou, can I make one more comment? Without visual examples and without a visual document in front of us, we each have to be responsible for having the document that's necessary to do this.
Yep.
This
yes,
is,
you do.
this
That's part of the job.
it may be part of the job, but it is also a situation in which we're lumbering through a process that could maybe be made more efficient if we could step back now that we have the time, and this is our focus, to work with our legal counsel, the 2 most involved planning board members, a member of the DPW, and bring this back to the board with more of a comprehensive conclusion. Going through word by word is not clear to
But
me.
this is
You-
Tom's baby. He created
No,
it.
hold it.
He's just
Stop
trying to
it.
get through one pass,
Stop.
just
Stop
one
with the,
pass.
stop. Stop with the Tom's baby. It's, by the way, it's not
It
16
is your
pages.
baby, man.
Well, we're pretty much at the end of this anyway. It's not 16 pages, but so, and I already see a change in the next section that I need to make. But our job, whether you like it or not, the planning board has the authority to pass regulations. And that means going over it, particularly if it's new, going over it word by word, or paragraph by paragraph, section by section. I don't know any other way to present it. Because it's our job and it falls on us to know what the damn thing says and how it's going to be applied.
Yes, but
So
we are.
I'm sorry if that
but-
burdens everybody. So here's what I'm going to suggest.
Not me, Tom. I'm hanging in.
Here's what I'm going to suggest in taking into account what Amy just said. The working group is reforming. Clark is now our second representative on it. Clark and I are the two who are discussing this the most tonight. Carolyn and her law firm are going to be very much involved going forward on the working group. Let this go back to the working group. Clark and I would essentially be the subcommittee. Brian Joyce is not a regular part of the working group process, but there's certainly no reason why we can't consult with him further on the various topics. I already can see things that need to be rewritten. There's things Carolyn has already commented on that need to be integrated into this. That's fine. If you want to refer this back to the working group with the understanding that Clark and I are going to be on it and direct us to consult with DPW, public safety, and whoever else we need to consult with, that's fine. That's fine. And because Carolyn's firm will be involved with the bylaws, we might make this tie into other new things going on more smoothly than it might be. This could be jumping the gun without some bylaw changes, but you know, it's been brought up because there are issues that are confronting us on these subjects. We are outliers in some areas and should not be. And it is our primary job to protect the safety of the residents by making sure they have adequate roadways in town. So I'm fine with doing that at this point. Clark, if you want to add something, go right
Yes,
ahead.
just quickly. I mean, this is going to be fine. I mean, we're already into it for almost 2 hours, but I will say that philosophically, we need the planning board as a group. We need to get their input on the philosophical aspects of this. Like your most recent comment, are we an outlier or do we make it Cohasset? Is there something fundamental about some of the land use patterns that have happened in Cohasset that are okay, and then are there some that are really objectionable? What like, owing to what Amy said, what about the future of land development or redevelopment in Cohasset? How do we address that as opposed to trying to match up with other communities? I think that's a fundamental question that will drive what we're doing with these regulations. But I would expect a lively debate and discussion about this, and not necessarily just say, oh, okay, Tom says we're an outlier and that's wrong. And I would expect everybody to weigh in. I mean, it could be four out of 5 people could agree with Tom, we're an outlier and that's wrong somehow morally or code wise. But I still would expect a robust discussion about the fundamental philosophy that drives the regulation.
So I
Well,
completely-
and that in essence ties into really what the working group is doing and why this proposal generated from the working group, because we're looking at we're looking at a complete comprehensive review of the bylaw that hasn't been looked at in that way in at least 40, 50 years, possibly longer. And, I've given this, so much thought because I'm so involved in this that, I guess, as I said, maybe this is not ready until we get more direction on where the bylaws going, because they all have to tie together and they all have to work together. So,
There is a merger, Tom, between the big picture and the details.
oh yeah, I
And,
know.
and when we were doing the master plan, we talked about, top down and bottom up. And then this access regulations is really no different. We really have to get the philosophical big picture stuff down and agree, and then work out the details. And they can be both worked on simultaneously.
Yeah, no, and you'll hear this from me when we reconvene the working group, We haven't in the working group gotten into the substance of the table of area regulations at all. We danced
Can
around
we save that
topics.
for another day?
No, I'm just
take
saying that,
access?
this regulation ties into the topics we will be discussing in the table of it, which is going to direct the future development patterns of this town. And it is a wider discussion that has to take place and will be taking place, and that you now as on the committee will be part of. I'm happy to defer this to further study by the working group and bring this back at another time. But with the caveat, again, as we discuss these things, the horse keeps getting out of the barn, and under our current common driveway regs, my personal opinion, other people's opinion, it's an end around the subdivision control law. As long as we all understand that, and that we continue to operate under that system until we make change, I'm fine with studying this and fine tuning it further. It is one piece of a much bigger picture that we are looking at. Amy.
So basically, we have two situations which I think are in parallel. The master plan implementation committee reached a logjam for a bunch of really important reasons. The issues that were facing it were really huge, and there was a lot of contention about what was to be done, how it was to be done, when it would be done, and who would do it. I think that the zoning bylaw working group was essentially in the same position. My recommendation is, luckily for you, you actually have a technical mechanism by which you can navigate the future about the zoning bylaw with the help of a legal expert who can help us know what it is that stands as standards and what stand as outliers. For the master plan implementation committee, we have to reconstitute ourselves. We have to decide what it is that's really, really important. I will say on behalf of Katie Dugan that we actually have a sidewalk going in that's going to get kids across 3A into the elementary school. And that was a push on the part of the master plan and days before and people here. So maybe what we need to think about is, how do we reconstitute ourselves as a planning apparatus so that we can take what we've learned and we move things forward. There are going to be different paths and different groups are going to do things, but it's going to allow us to essentially step back and say, okay, we did a lot. Now we need to, step back, say which way we think we're going to go next, and then come together as a planning board and work together as a planning board to achieve two different outcomes. One is the implementation of the master plan, and the other is the implementation of a revision of our bylaws. And just, we're going to have to find our way. We don't know how to do this, but I think that we can do it because people are committed to it.
Deirdre, you've been quiet all night. Do you have any thoughts you want to add before I try to wrap this up?
I think, Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm with you. I hear the comments about we're on the outside. Cohasset is honestly a sitting duck. Everything I hear from developers, and I hear them, is that come to Cohasset because there's no rules. We need to work on that. And We need to make sure, especially on the development end with subdivisions, that we're in control of it. I came from Long Island, New York. I have seen subdivisions like you cannot believe, with no boundaries. That's why my parents left years ago, and that's why I'm not there. We need to work on it. Cohasset is a beautiful town that needs to be preserved from that ugliness that can happen. So that whole piece, and I give both you, Tom, and Clark some, if you can, we can come back to the board with some more tighter, clearer
That's fine.
descriptions. I appreciate your time. As I said to you before, I'm still learning all the language, but I'm
There's a
trying
lot to
really
it.
hard to get on board. I just know in my heart, I'm now married to a family that's been here since 1970. They have seen this town change drastically. So I'm just trying to understand and make sure that we are preserving what we have in this town.
Okay. Carolyn, is there anything you'd like to add or suggest?
No, I think it does make sense. I don't know whether, Tom, you want to get through the first pass of the remainder of this document as Clark was suggesting, or whether we just stop at this point. But I do think that maybe a smaller group, wordsmith this, tweaking it a little bit more, and then bringing it back to the board would be helpful. But I also agree that there might be some decision points here where we need some
Right.
policy guidance from the board. What direction do you want to go in? And so we might have to go back to the drawing board once or twice, but
Right, the fork
Yeah.
in the road, right? Left or right?
exactly.
This is what I'm gonna, so the working group, again, trying to get a meeting started for July 6th, if it's just 4 of us, or we're back to a full complement of 7. And then meeting with you, Carolyn, and your colleague. I'm anticipating a very intense work schedule because there are people suggesting we need to have the whole thing done by town meeting of 2023, which was the original plan, but we somewhat got sidetracked by not having anything really come forward at this last town meeting. So, we're going to have an intense schedule to bring forward, and the select board wants it in pieces. An intense schedule of reviewing and vetting, including this board and the formal process this board has to undertake. A lot of bylaw changes for both the fall and the spring town meeting. So this, as a regulation, is kind of a little side issue, but I think what we can do, and I would encourage everybody here on the board, if there are specific issues and questions you would have for experts like our public safety directors, like our DPW director on anything, we can task them to go off on the side, since they're not part of the working group effort, and say, here's where we are. Any other things you can suggest? If we were faced with a situation that, as Clark has brought up, with an existing road, it's inadequate, house wants to be added, is there some more criteria, objective criteria we can put in determining whether the road is adequate or inadequate for that additional usage? Yeah, please write them down. I'm not going to say I'm the only one who writes anything around here, but it's our job, the 5 of us, to jump and dive into this stuff at a level of excruciating detail. It shouldn't be just 2 of us talking about it. So please, in the near term, please put together any questions that you would want to direct to our town and outside expertise, and we'll deal with that. And the working group will deal with that. Primarily, it'll probably be Clark and I dealing with it, and that's fine. And so I'll move right now that we suspend this public hearing. Lauren and Carolyn, can we keep it just open-ended? Or would we have to come back and start a new public hearing process?
Let's schedule again for a month.
All right.
I know it's summertime, but we could then continue if we've gotten nowhere, okay?
Yeah, all right. So I mean, in anticipation that we do get the working group meeting on July 6th, at the tail end of our meeting on July 13th, you and I can give an update about,
That doesn't hurt at all.
we can give an update of whether the working group can even take it on, given the intense schedule I'm going to propose to them on the 6th. So, all
But
right,
it wouldn't hurt to ask the members of the board to reread the latest version. That's the one on the bottom on the
Yeah.
planning board website, and see if there's anything that jumps out at them. Either, pro con, something that they really love, or something that they really hate, or they're confused about. That would help us do our job to make these to make the next pass.
and if it helps any of you, the working group, I would have to wait till Katie's back in town, but there was, we did our data and our analysis of our common driveway regs versus neighbors. So, we do have the backup for what's the norm and what's the mean and all that stuff. And then, like Kevin brought up a great example tonight of a particular street. Think about it. When you're reading through this and thinking, well, is this right? Is this right? Think about particular streets, Howell Road, Black Horse, Black Rock Lane, any of these roads in town where you live or where you don't live, and say, how would this apply to that road? And that may lead to, a very good question, comment, or suggested change when you think of it into a real life situation.
I agree.
Yeah. So, and your road as well. Lauren, you were going to say something, yes.
Yeah, sorry, just because this is a public hearing, you do need to make a motion to continue to a date time certain. And if you want to go 1 month out, we can suggest July 13th at 6:30.
Okay.
Can we go a little beyond that? Maybe the
We can
end of
do-
July?
July 27th?
Good. So moved.
Yeah, actually, that'll give us time to get input from town, DPW and fire chief. Do they really want to get involved in this and help us out? But, all right. So it's been moved. Somebody to move this to
Second.
continue to July 27th.
Second,
Thank you, Deirdre. All right. Roll call. Clark,
Clark Brewer, aye.
Tom Callahan, aye.
Amy Glassmeyer, aye.
Kevin Heine, aye.
Deirdre Hobson, aye.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Um,
everyone.
Anything else before we depart?
Motion to adjourn?
Second,
Okay. I'll just roll call.
Clark Brewer, aye.
Tom Callahan, aye.
Amy Glassmeyer, aye.
Kevin Heine, aye.
Deirdre Hobson, aye.
All right. Thank
Aye.
you, Carolyn and
Thank
you.
Angela. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
all being
Thank you,
here. I
Lauren.
see that we did have some other attendees. Thank you for paying attention, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.